This is the secret sauce that Steve and his team are bringing to you on this podcast.
And I'm sure that at some point in time, you've had a seller that wanted to sell, a buyer that wanted to buy, but the lender is another component in here that if they see too much risk, they're going to walk away from the deal.
Our goal is to maximize the total transaction value, as we call it, with the most favorable terms and conditions possible. I am active on social media calling these people out. If I've made 100 posts, I've made 200 posts or responses to posts, and not one time have they ever responded.
Hey everybody, Steve Burton here at Scale to Sell. Welcome back for episode 68 with our good friend Jeff Snell. Jeff, you've been on with us a couple times. Jeff is the founder and principal broker of ENLIGN Advisors, again, based out of Raleigh, North Carolina. He's my go-to guy anytime we list a business owner and they want to go to market or whatever. And so you were on episode 24 and then 35. But, you made a distinction at that roundtable that stuck with us a lot about the valuation. We talk about it a lot. Most business owners don't get a valuation done. They look at a profit and loss statement or their balance sheets or whatever, their bank account. And but I want to talk a little bit about that, and what your thought was there and just the points you were trying to make, Jeff, if you don't mind.
So we were talking about a lot of important topics as it relates to business ownership, planning for an exit, or at least thinking about an exit, even if the horizon is long enough to not be actively planning. And my thoughts are, over the 23 years that I've been fortunate to work with business owners, is that part of planning is just knowing what your real baseline is. And a lot of business owners, if not the majority of them, don't worry about what's my business worth. They're looking at their cash flow. They're looking at their accounts receivable. They're looking at their accounts payable. They're growing their business with employees. They're trying to onboard clients, and we get that. But the opportunity that Scale to Sale brings to your clients in partnership with us is the ability to have business valuation services at no cost because of the referral that allow management to start thinking about the exit and maybe make some strategic changes in their operations to maximize that value. So the offer that we make as a team is that we will provide valuation services based on thousands and thousands, and I'm not exaggerating, of completed valuations on an annual basis, at minimum, more if it's appropriate, again, at no cost, so that the owner of businesses that choose to work with you know we're at $500,000, we're at $1 million, we're at 10 million, we're at 25 million, we're at 50 million, and provide consulting services or advice. I'm very often quoted as saying, I'm an advisor, I'm not a decider. The clients are the deciders, but I want to provide them with the information that they need that, from our experience, will maximize their value at exit. Again, whether that might be desired in 6 months, a year, 5 years, 10 years, it really doesn't matter the time frame. I think knowledge is power.
Most of these business owners, it occurs to me in my experience, that they go through this process once. Unlike a house where the average person, I think, has about 5 to 6 houses in their lifetime. So they learn a little bit out of the first sale and they carry that through to the second sale, third sale. But if you're a single business owner, you've been owning this business for a while, years, maybe decades, and it's your first exit, it's different, Jeff. We hear it a lot of times, well, I'm going to retire in 3 years or 5 years or whatever the deal is. Well, how do you know that the business is worth enough and where you're at? The other thing that you mentioned is that when somebody buys you, they're looking at your numbers, of course, but I remember you saying they're buying future cash flow. What is that business going to do for them? Not just where it's at, where's it going, where's it going to be, what can they do to prop it up? And so it's not just getting some numbers out there, it's providing other details, some advice to help the current owners build it up, walk away with more money, of course, and then the new owners. But just some thoughts there, if you don't mind.
Our goal when we're working with business owners that want or need to sell, and those are two very distinct differences, is to maximize value. 98+% of the time we're representing sellers. And we do work with buyers from time to time on very unique situations, but our goal is to maximize the total transaction value, as we call it, with the most favorable terms and conditions possible. And what I appreciate probably most about the relationship with your firm and your team is that you're looking not just, hey, call us up when we have $10 million to invest. You're looking to support them and stand by them and work with firms like mine so that when they're ready to exit, they have a true legitimate retirement. Your team's doing analysis, they're doing tax planning, it's holistic. And I've been doing this for a little bit, and that's really rare. So if you're a business owner and at some point you're going to sell or you're going to exit. Exit is what our industry calls it. You might die at your desk. That's an exit. It's not an ideal exit, but it is an exit. If you want to be proactive without it taking 20 hours out of your week, engage with Steve and his team and start feeling more comfortable about what the real numbers look like, what the tax implications are, or what they may not be with planning in advance of 3 months before closing. But that's the whole goal here, is to ethically maximize the value. The values are very often, unless it's a strategic buyer or a public company, limited by what's called debt service coverage ratio. That's what a lender is willing to lend on a particular acquisition. And maybe we can have another podcast on the specifics of that because it gets pretty detailed. But at a high level, debt service coverage ratio, the lender wants to know how much are we lending, how much is the debt service, and how much profit is left over after the buyer pays themselves a livable wage. Lots of subjectivity there. It's complicated. And that's why I feel, at least, that engaging with a planning team like Scale to Sell, with tax planners, M&A advisors, and others, because sometimes there's equipment valuators. As you say, Steve, it can be a very spaghetti-like process. And if you haven't done it before, and maybe it's the only time you're going to do it in your life, it's the most valuable transaction of your life in most cases. You need a team around you. And I'm very confident in working with the Scale to Sell team. And we've had some great interactions. So
when somebody's coming in to buy a business, a seasoned, maybe it's a competitor, maybe it's a private equity firm, they're doing this analysis of your business. I mean, they're wanting to mitigate their own risk. Is this a true, solid business with upward potential where we can grow it? And they're looking at mitigating risk. In your analysis and when you do the valuation, I'm sure that in the numbers and other conversations with the owners, you see risk. In order to create and improve the value of the business, eliminating or greatly reducing those risks to not only the current buyer, but future buyers. I think but is that part of your analysis and just what you bring to the table, Jeff?
yeah, well, absolutely. So risk mitigation is on the minds of every buyer. Now, to an extreme, the buyer is trying to risk out every dollar, and that generally does not lead to a successful transaction. Looking at the financial risk is pretty much math if you know what you're doing. But they're also looking at culture. They're looking at the term of relationships with employees, especially the key employees. They're looking at term of relationships with their clients and whether those are contractual, whether it's recurring revenue or not. They're looking at supply chain issues with their vendor relationships. Our process I try not to look at it because it gives me a headache, but I think we're at 141 touch points on risk mitigation. And through our process, we look to mitigate those, of course. And if not, then articulate them in a way that a buyer sees opportunity more than risk.
And I'm sure that at some point in time, you've had a seller that wanted to sell, a buyer that wanted to buy, but the lender is another component in here. If they see too much risk, they're going to walk away from the deal. And even though, again, the buyer and the seller might be eager to get the deal done, if they can't get the financing, I think that risk right there would blow up a lot of deals.
It's a key factor. And I think that's where an experienced M&A advisor can step in and start introducing creative structuring ideas. It might be rollover equity. It might be an increased amount of seller financing. It could be mezzanine financing. There are a lot of tools in the toolbox if you're familiar with them. So above market deals, and when I say above market, I'm talking about the multiple of earnings is higher than a bank is going to sign off on all by itself. We have a nice suite of solutions that if the buyer and seller are comfortable moving in that direction, that we can get done.
Just saw a post on some social media site. I think it's been 3 years since that M&A movie came out here. Anyway, that I took part in, was an executive producer in, and I remember some things. I had flashbacks of some of the stats and just the comments from different industry people like yourself, and about how many businesses don't successfully sell. You may sell the business, but you have regrets later. You didn't get top dollar, and or the deal blew up altogether. But so those things flash back to me, and then the valuation. I remember in the movie how these team of people would go around to businesses, and they would give them call them out of the blue, give them a really high multiple, high valuation, and then nickeled and dined them, and then just really got them down to nothing and bought the business at a discount. So just don't take anybody that calls you. I have a business owner I was talking to recently, HVAC company, Jeff, and he said, well, I've had offers of 20x. And that may be true. That's a hot industry right now, no doubt about it. The valuations that you do on businesses, they're not all the same. Smaller businesses have one method, another business, but just a little bit about your process there of the evaluation, what that looks like.
First, the M&A movie is fantastic. I'll call out one of your other executive producers who was in the movie, Scott Bushke, very close friend of mine. I think what that movie was really calling out is preying on, I hate to say unsophisticated sellers, because you're not going to be a sophisticated seller if you've never done it before, but vulnerable sellers. I think that's probably a better phrase. Preying on a vulnerable seller, telling them, using your number, we're willing to pay $20 million. And then buyers, and this was a lot less frequent 3 years ago. It is systemic today. It's part of our pre-qual process. It's very detailed. But 3 years ago, Scott saw it. I saw it, but he was motivated enough to partner with you and others to make this movie, to educate business sellers. Just because somebody makes an offer doesn't mean that's what you're going to get. They're going to have a due diligence process. And in the movie, they were trying to exclude professional advisors, attorneys, and M&A advisors and whatnot, because they're preying on this acquisition. So to have a team around you that can see that, where in social media, there are dozens. Now, they change about every year to 18 months because they realize it doesn't work, but they're promoting buy a multi-million-dollar business for no money down. Well, that doesn't work. I am active on social media calling these people out. If I've made 100 posts, I've made 200 posts or responses to posts, and not one time have they ever responded. Not one time have they tried to call me out, because they know it's not true. They're selling $89 courses or $129 courses, and I'm getting hundreds of inquiries on business with people that say in our NDA, we require more than 10% seller financing. Well, why is the seller of a quality business going to be the bank? They don't have to be. They've already earned it. They've been in this business for a decade or 2 or 3, or sometimes 5 or 6. It doesn't make sense. So the process of pre-qualification is important, but your question was about valuation. So in valuation, it's not a simple thing. I don't like to self-promote, but for the purposes of credibility, I'm the credentialing chairman for the International Business Brokers Association, have been since 2015. Just recently, January 1st of this year, I became the credentialing chairman for the M&A source, which is lower middle market transactions up to, we'll call it $100 million. The details and the inflections on recasting, or what some people call normalizing financials, the purpose is to illustrate to a buyer what they could expect the company produce in the future. And those add backs sometimes are subjective, sometimes they're automatic, like amortization, depreciation, always added back. Those are non-cash. That's a tax calculation. But there's other things like travel, entertainment. Well, is that business? Is it not business? We can have that conversation. I have a construction client, and this is hypothetical, but I have a construction client, and he drives a King Ranch truck. It costs I don't know how much they cost, but probably $100,000. Is that a business expense, or is that a personal expense, or is it part of it personal, part of it business? The nuances in recasting or normalization require somebody that has a firm grip on the ship's wheel, because you don't just make it in a spreadsheet. You have to be able to defend it. And then you have to be able to articulate it through credit card statements, through bank statements, because it is very difficult. But circling back to the beginning of my comments, just because someone says they're going to pay you $20 million, what they're likely going to do, if you feel that's a crazy high number, this is what they're trying to do. And this is the secret sauce that Steve and his team are bringing to you on this podcast. What they're doing is locking up your business with an exclusivity clause, and then they're going to wear you down. We call that deal fatigue. So you get to the point that you are so tired of providing financial documents, having interviews, being asked questions, that you agree to whatever they ultimately offer and say, I'm done, I'm out. Because in your mind, they know when you accepted that LOI or IOI at $20 million, we're human beings. We're already spending that money in our head, right? We're investing it. We're buying an RV. We're getting a vacation home. Whatever your goals are, that process starts. And a lot of buyers that make these crazy offers know that, and it's part of their strategy. And it's an advisor's role to put a stop to that before it ever starts.
There you go. The multiples, talking about the multiples, like the typical multiples. And I know we have businesses that are just not sellable, right? They don't have a team, don't have processes in place, and they may be making a decent living, but it's just not sellable to a third party. And then if you have a roofing company, a home services type company, HVAC, like I mentioned, I know we got some construction companies that we listing and all that, but just in general right here, a multiple, because people read an article, they have a buddy that sold a business and supposedly got this multiple, but you hear them all over the range. But typically, what can somebody expect and how that, a lot of them think it's, hey, well, I did $5 million in sales last year. I'm going to get, and they always listen to the biggest number, not right. And so if it's somebody got an 8, they forget that 4, that's somebody that what might be the industry norm. But just a little bit about multiples, if you don't mind.
Multiples are obviously industry specific. And the industries that you mentioned, home services, even if it's commercial, but home services, blue collar, are very attractive right now, extremely attractive. Roll-ups, strategics, private equity groups, they're very popular. They're obviously going to command a higher multiple. But let's talk about and dive in relatively specifically in how multiples work. So one, there's a lender component. It's got to be lendable. But there's 2 ways to measure the profitability of a company. Seller discretionary earnings, SDE, some call it seller discretionary cash flow, but it's the same thing. That's where you add back what the seller is paying themselves at a fair market rate. That's going to be a higher number. Then you have EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. That's where you do not add back the operator's load, which includes their salary, their benefits, etc. So if we're talking about an SDE or SDCF calculation, depending upon the industry, we're typically going to be between 2 and 3, maybe 3.5 times earnings if we don't bump into a debt service coverage ratio calculation. So let's just say 2 to 3. If we're looking at EBITDA, we're typically looking at 6 to 8. But here's the challenge there. And the crossover point is about $750,000 a year of profit. So about that point, these 2 calculations are going to be the same. Above 750, we want to look at EBITDA. Below 750, we're going to look at SDCF. The challenge in lower middle market right now is that with interest rates being where they are, even the EBITDA multiples are running into debt service coverage ratio caps. So if I'm negotiating a transaction at 8 times, then there has to be 1 pari passu lending because the SBA cap is $5 million. So if we have an $8 million deal, I have to bridge a $3 million gap. It's not going to be with an SBA guarantee because it's capped. Well, except in manufacturing. I'm working on that with the SBA, but that's a whole nother conversation. So that's going to require creative structuring. We talked earlier about rollover equity, seller financing, additional cash at closing. So multiples today on the larger companies, every deal is different, but anything below 6, I'm going to be fighting and kicking and screaming to get it higher. Anything at 6 or above, I'm going to be focused on preferable terms and conditions for the seller. and we're getting deals done. I mean, if it were easy, everybody would be doing it. It is a challenge, but they're getting done. We are not in the wasteland of M&A right now. Things are actually pretty good.
And guys, we've covered a lot of ground, and we pointed out 2 or 3 other podcasts, and I've got some in my, the multiple thing. I think it could come back, and we'll spend some more time on that. But, it's an interesting world we're living in right now. And I was just thinking, Jeff, the data centers that are going up, people that are electrical contractors and that type of business that can get in there, because these things are popping up everywhere. So if they're going to build them and there's all kinds of money floating around, you would think that there's some opportunity here either to improve your business. I have one electrical contractor's already in the space, and they're just killing it, crushing it right now. Are you seeing any trends right there with companies that are looking to buy somebody that might be building out data centers or has something to do strong with AI and just everything to support that industry, that growing industry?
Well, there's a lot of venture capital and a lot of private equity that has money in that space. But again, there's structuring challenges. Because if you're looking to buy a commercial electrical contractor that has the licenses in our states called an unlimited electrical, then you don't know what's going to happen to AI. You don't know what's going to happen to these data centers. There's a lot of community pushback in some areas about building them. So if a seller has expectations of a high multiple or a high price because of future projects, and the buyer is saying, well, I don't know if there's going to be those future projects, then again, we have to go back to creative structuring. SBA doesn't allow earnouts. That was the go-to method. I think this, you think this. Buyer says, well, if it happens, I'll pay you that. It was simple, right? And all of a sudden, government said, we're not doing earnouts anymore. And I had a transaction that was going to die if I didn't find a solution. So I came up with the concept of the seller-forgivable note. That was, 8 years ago, 10 years ago. It's now the de facto earnout structure. It works essentially the same. It has a cap where earnouts don't typically. But if there's not SBA involved, then we can do an earnout. And we can say, all right, we're going to pay you $10 million for your electrical contracting company based on your trailing 12 months or your prior tax year. But if you get this $20 million AI contract or data center contract, we'll kick in 10% of the profit or 20% of the profit. And my logic there is, well, you're the seller. You laid the groundwork for that sale. You invested in that potential opportunity. If it comes to fruition and it just happens to be post-transaction, then they should get a little taste of that.
Hey guys, we've covered a lot of ground today with our good friend Jeff Snell. And Jeff mentioned this early, I'm a financial advisor. I have a tax planning team. Jeff is part of the M&A team. He doesn't work for me. I don't work for him. I just trust him. And he's a solid guy with all kinds of credentials. You can check out his website. What is your website, Jeff?
ENLIGN.com, ENLIGN.com.